I'm going to start by mentioning the 10th century King Hywel Dda, credited with codification of the native laws of Wales. The code was progressively principled, especially in terms of recompense rather than retribution on the status of women. The Dictionary of Welsh Biography states that Hywel's law was responsible for the consciousness of national unity prevalent among the Welsh of the Middle Ages. I just wanted you to hold those thoughts of progressive values and codification, so I'm going to come back to those. In modern times, Wales has had a drip feed process of executive devolution. The current devolution settlement is in the Wales Act 2017, and it's the first reserved powers model for Wales. But quoting Professor Thomas Watkin and Daniel Greenberg in their book, Legislating for Wales, the reservations are considerable in number. There's been much debate over whether the move to a reserved powers model has actually enhanced the Assembly's powers or contracted them, and even greater doubt as to whether the new settlement has delivered the promised clear devolution settlement that would stand the test of time. It's been described as carrying the seeds of its own destruction, and Plaid Cymru voted against it. There is a complex scheme of reservations, exceptions and carve-outs, and for those actually advocating Senedd legislation, the task is now to ensure that no provision relates to any one or more of the reserved matters, general or specific. And actually, on the whole, the advantage has shifted in favour of those who might wish to challenge Senedd legislation. The Wales Act also included a provision that the Senedd and Welsh Government are permanent parts of the UK's constitutional arrangements, not to be abolished without a referendum, and devolved greater responsibility to the Senedd to run its own affairs. And under the Senedd and Elections Wales Act, it's recognised now as a fully fledged Welsh Parliament, also extending the voting franchise. But at the time that the Wales Act 2017 was drafted, the previous Welsh Government had drafted its own Government in Laws in Wales Bill, which is referred to by some as a written constitution for a sub-state polity. Some of the differences between that bill and the Wales Act are that whilst the Wales Act merely recognises a distinct body of made in Wales law and merely recognises the Sewell Convention, the Welsh Government Bill provided that Wales and England become two legal jurisdictions and that the Sewell Convention is given statutory force rather than just statutory recognition. In the view of the 5th Senedd, Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee, in its inquiry into Wales's changing constitution, without further clarification, the Sewell Convention will be rendered obsolete and of little practical value. The Welsh Government is currently challenging the Internal Market Act through a judicial review, and that's based on breach of the principle of legality. And another development, and this is me now going back to codification, has been the Legislation Wales Act 2019. That follows from a Law Commission report on the form and accessibility of the law applicable in Wales. It's described as groundbreaking, as many things in Wales are, but it does show how things could be done differently. Initially, the Law Commission recommendations were advocating something more akin to codes of civil law jurisdictions. But what the 2019 Act does is provide an Interpretation Act for Wales, but also requires that for each Senedd term, Welsh ministers and the Council General must prepare a programme contributing to the consolidation and codification of Welsh law. A Welsh code isn't a legal instrument in its own right, it's more about presentation and organisation, but there are Senedd standing orders introducing code discipline. I mean, I wonder whether that will make the law accessible to people, even if making it more accessible to through their lawyers. Will that greater understanding have some positive impacts on unity, or will it introduce more disunity in terms of the form of Welsh and English law, respectively? I had been asked whether that codification has any relation to a codified constitution, but not really. The case for a codified constitution with federalist reform is favoured by a lot of past and present Welsh ministers, but I don't think this codification exercise is related to that. My segue into legislation of a constitutional character is actually into something called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. That places a sustainability principle as central to public administration in Wales, and actually requires public bodies to act in a way that seeks to ensure the needs of present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's also coupled with a distinctive Welsh approach to social and economic rights and the incorporation of international human rights into Welsh law. And there are research recommendations for a Human Rights Wales Act, and Wales is following a similar trajectory to Scotland on human rights, which is different to the rest of the UK. And I was mentioning this because values, I think, are central to unity and disunity. There are reasons for a traditional Welsh Labour dominance, and they go back to matters of class, religion and language. They're less important today, but what we see is more fragmentation. What baffles many people is the fact that Wales voted to leave the EU, despite being so dependent on the single market and European funds. Much of that can be put down to the centrality of national identity, and Professors Henderson and Wyn Jones, in their book on Englishness, have found that those who feel strongly Welsh, but without feeling the same attachment to Britishness, voted heavily to remain. However, the substantial majority in Wales who feel both strongly English and strongly British, or strongly English, tended to vote leave. Another group that voted heavily leave were the Welsh British, so those who feel both strongly Welsh and strongly British. What does that mean for the UK as a union? The Welsh British tend to be Eurosceptic, but supportive of devolution. The English British in Wales tend to be both Eurosceptic and Devosceptic. The most hostile to devolution are the British only, not Welsh. Those most in favour of more devolution and those most likely to support independence are those who see themselves as Welsh only. There's a whole range of other divergences too in Wales of social values of particular identity groups on the left, right and libertarian authoritarian scale. That leads to differences in voting behaviour. So arguably the future of Welsh politics is going to be much more fractured. We can pretty quickly dispense, however, with abolition of the Assembly. Abolish the Assembly, a force was well resourced. I think the phrase is it was absolutely annihilated in the 2021 Senedd elections. Wales is a land of commissions, conventions and panels, and there's a few more to talk about. A 2019 report of a Commission on Justice in Wales recommended the full executive and legislative devolution of justice powers and attendant financial resources. A 2019 Plaid Cymru Commission on how it should prepare for holding an independence referendum favoured a confederal League of the Isles rather than a federal UK. On this approach, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales would form a confederation with aspects of federal type control established in key policy portfolios said to reflect principles of equality, solidarity, and each nation will have a distinct jurisdiction and hold all constitutional powers and rights which are not by treaty delegated to the joint institutions. In July 2020, the Senedd debated Wales's constitutional future. A Plaid Cymru motion calling on Welsh Government to seek authority for an independence referendum was rejected. The Senedd instead voted for a Labour amendment, a commitment to Wales's continuing membership of a reformed United Kingdom. Welsh Government proposes that the UK is best now seen as a voluntary association of nations, taking the form of a multinational state, and that such an association must be based on recognition of popular sovereignty in each constituent part. It also argues that the concept of parliamentary sovereignty, which we've been discussing, no longer provides a sound foundation for this evolving constitution. It also supports the principle of subsidiarity, requiring that legislative and governmental responsibilities should be allocated to the most local level at which they can be performed efficiently and effectively. Just a week ago, Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru signed a cooperation agreement that's said to build on shared values of social solidarity, sustainability and democracy, as well as being a response to the so-called muscular unionism of the current UK government. They will work together over 3 years to deliver various policy commitments alongside a commitment to Senedd reform. The Welsh Secretary Simon Hart denounced that agreement, noting it could allow Plaid Cymru to claim credit for Welsh Government policies while continuing to call itself an opposition party. That has implications for collective responsibility and scrutiny. There's a further mechanisms document which sets out the government and accountability frameworks that I'm going to admit to not having read yet. Finally, there is a constitutional commission that's just been established. Its first objective is to consider and develop options for fundamental reform of the constitutional structures of the UK, in which Wales remains an integral part. Its second objective is to consider and develop all progressive principal options to strengthen Welsh democracy and deliver improvements for the people of Wales. It's co-chaired by Dr. Rowan Williams and Professor Laura McAllister, due to report at the end of 2023. And I'm doing a lot of standing on shoulders of giants in my presentation, so I'm going to leave the last word to Professor McAllister, who said it would be completely absurd to rule out independence as an option. We will consider federalism, strengthen devolution, Devo Max, a free association, along with any other serious options for radical change. We have a mandate to be both comprehensive and far-sighted in setting out and scrutinising options for a better, more sustainable democracy in our country. Diolch yn fawr iawn.